We've got with us Dr. Sean Roberts of Cardiff University. Sean, this is like the fourth time we've been on with you, isn't it?
Yeah, great to be here. Yeah, and
Is it?
wonderful to be back.
Thanks for hanging with us. And Dr. Cole Robertson from the Center of Language Studies at Radboud University and the Department of Psychology, Emory University. Cole, welcome onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you are Robertson. How is that?
The dynamic duo. We go back a long
Yeah.
time. Sean, was I your first PhD supervisee? Sean, you were a postdoc?
Yeah, that's right. So we were, in the Max Planck Institute in the Netherlands, where Hedvig was also there. And yeah, it has been. Yeah, it's been a long time. I had to just before this, I had to read over the paper to remember what was in it. Because a lot of this stuff, some of the studies were done quite a long time ago now. Yeah, and really, so all this stuff is based on Cole's PhD work, which we'll get into.
Although there are a couple new studies in the paper we're going to talk about, which I did as a postdoc at Emory.
Yes. So really, this work goes back a long way, and you've both had such illustrious careers in so many different ways in linguistics. And so I want to dive into some of that as well. But to start with, could you both tell us a little bit about what you've been doing? Sean, we know that you've been doing work on perception, and you're also a bit of an enthusiast in replication, or just the scientific method. Or tell us about what you've been doing.
So this response is the kind of thing that I get from linguists. Is what do? You see, what is it? I guess I'm really interested in methods, and particularly statistical methods, and sort of big data stuff. And so the origin of this project, if you cast your mind back to 2013, which seems like a very long time ago. And just to give you an impression of how long ago that was. So I had to look this up, but our studio was still in beta. And the LME4 package for doing mixed effects modeling was still in beta. The World Atlas of Language Structures, which is this big database of language structures, was only just a few years old.
We use it all the time, and this was just brand new at the time.
Yeah, and GitHub was only a few years old. But it was this kind of exciting time where these sort of new big databases of cross-cultural stuff were appearing. And we had new statistical tools. You could sort of do all this stuff on your laptop for the first time to take all that data and start finding connections between the stuff. So I was at the Max Planck Institute at the same time as people like Fiona Jordan, who were looking at kinship, and Michael Dunn, who was looking at word order, and Hedvig, which was starting to put together the sort of basis of GramBank, which would come to dominate all databases of typology.
I think I was the parasite in this situation because I was only employed as a student assistant. I wasn't even a PhD student. And then I just bullied my way socially into all these places and made all these connections that I've really been able to use for the last 10 years.
Cole, I've been checking out your work, and you've been experienced in lots of ways involving large language models, but that's lately. You're also doing a lot of stuff with emotion and with verbs. Could you tell us what you're into and what you've been doing?
I have a fairly eclectic background. So I did a master's in cognitive and evolutionary anthropology, which is in an institute that was founded by Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary psychologist, who had done a lot of work on the origin of language and the evolution of language, which is to say not specifics to do with the way that languages evolve, but why humans possess the faculty at all and what were the evolutionary dynamics that gave rise to that in the Paleolithic.
I seem to remember Robin Dunbar's name because of the primate brain size hypothesis. Dunbar noticed that as the brains of different primates get bigger, the number of individuals in their social sphere goes up. And if we extend that to humans, then we probably have room for about 150, maybe 200 people in our monkey sphere.
Yeah, this is the Dunbar number.
Yes.
That's what he is most famous for, is correlating brain size with social group size to arrive at a prediction of the human group size from the size of our neocortex. And the notion there is that our kind of social connections and social cognition is actually what drove that encephalization process. So we got big brains because we like to have lots of friends, and that helped us fend off predators. In any case, when I did this master's, I did a module on the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And I was really struck by the notion that differences between languages around the world could give rise to differences in perception. And I decided I wanted to do a PhD focusing on that. This was about 2015. And at the time, Chen's results, 2013, were freshly released. And Sean's publication was, I think, on the verge of being released in PLOS. And so I approached Asfamijit and tried to find out if there was some interest in looking at this question about whether the way languages require us to speak about the future impacts the way we kind of think about and plan for the future.
Okay. So we have discussed Keith Chen's work on savings and what our languages require us to say. Could we just start there, maybe? So my memory is that Chen's hypothesis was that if your language had a grammatical future tense. Now, it's not whether you can talk about the future, because everybody can talk about the future. It's one of those things that we love to do. But not all of us have to use a special grammatical marker on our verbs to talk about the future. And the idea that he had was, if you didn't have one of those, then you were better at saving money because the future was kind of like the present, because you handled them both grammatically. So that was going to have a spooky effect on the way that we think and on the way that we behave. I say spooky effect. Is that a good way of describing it?
No, but it does seem magical, right? And I think one of the sort of achievements of Cole's work is making the effect much less magical. But that's right. So like if you talk about the future as different, it seems further away, and so you're less worried about it. You discount more the possible rewards in the future, so you're more likely to take stuff in the present rather than sort of saving for later. And you have to remember, like at the time, so as you can imagine, linguists got really angry about this, as they do with all sort of linguistic relativity stuff, but particularly because it seemed like such a big leap from the sort of small details of how we talk up to really big decisions that we make about our psychology.
But now, Cole, you did a PhD in this. Were you copying any of this anger, or did you notice this in the linguistic community? What was going on for you while you were interested in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a massive blowback, mostly online, like on blogs and stuff, criticizing Chen's basic typology, the way he was kind of broadly characterizing. I think he classed something like 130 different languages in terms of whether they require a future marker when you talk about the future, like a tense, or whether they don't. And some of that criticism, I think, was fair. Some was unfair. So, for instance, just to dig into the detail a bit, it's not whether a marker is required when you talk about the future generally, but in fact, when you make a prediction about the future. So this is a very important category when it comes to talking about the future. So you could say the main other ones are, I guess, schedules and intentions. So if you say in English, the train arrives at 5 p.m., that's acceptable. But it doesn't have will in it, doesn't have a future marker in it.
Just use present.
Exactly. You can use the present tense. For a schedule, similar with intentions, you can say, I'm going out later. And that's an intention. And you can also elide the future tense marker. But if you make a prediction, it rains tomorrow, you generally have to use some kind of future marker. And that's either like will or be going to, or one of these modal verbs like may or could or might. And so a lot of linguists said, well, look at all these counterexamples, like in English, for instance, where you can talk about the future without the future tense. Actually, maybe misunderstood slightly the nuance there, and that the definition was about predictions. But yes, I was certainly aware of the blowback. I don't think I was fully aware of the kind of contentiousness around linguistic relativity within the broader linguistics community. I had done a great books undergraduate degree, and then there's anthropology degrees and master's students. So I wasn't steeped in the history of kind of arguments and controversy over linguistic relativity within linguistics.
Well, I think what's really great about this new body of work is sort of reassessing like what more precisely the predictions are and how it is good to test them, but also just maybe acknowledging that like the effects may not always be very large, but they could still be there. Because I think part of the blowback comes from this idea of like an extreme version of linguistic relativity, where you're sort of programmed and you can't even see certain colors and you can't even imagine certain things. And that seems very extreme. And no one I know in this space who do research exploring and try to falsify these hypotheses usually push it that far. It's like, if you have a language that's like this, you're like a little bit more probable to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. At the same time, in the economics world, this was a really interesting result because the effect size seems sort of moderate if you're used to linguistic experiments, but is actually massive if you're used to economic things. So the ability to explain as much of the variation in people's economic behavior as Chen was able to do, if he was right, it would mean massive changes to economic policy and the ability to make quite a big difference. So I think like there was quite a big difference in the understanding of it in different fields. And whenever I've gone to talk to like biologists about it who aren't sort of connected to both of those things, they kind of think, oh yeah, okay, that seems interesting. What's so
Yeah.
so it's really interesting, like your attitude to it. People are coming to this question with a lot of baggage. Maybe baggage is the wrong word.
Yeah.
But
It's almost like the dating in evolutionary linguistics, historical linguistics. People also have a lot of baggage, and also in anthropology broadly, even just classifying cultures in any way has a lot of baggage that I think a lot of people are sort of now rummaging through and finding out what's actually making sense and what isn't.
I think being a linguist of a certain age, I think what drives linguists crazy, or what used to drive linguists crazy about it, is that it's one of those things that seems so intuitive to people who aren't linguists. They're like, oh, well, that totally makes sense that would be the case. And linguists say, it's just,
You say that, Daniel,
it's not that
but
simple.
I was so glad that you did this because both reading your paper that you kindly shared us the manuscript of, Cole and Sean, and Daniel's recap in the beginning, I actually have to remind myself every time if having a separate future makes you more or less likely to save money. Because I can, in my galaxy brain, I can totally support either case. I'm like, oh, if you don't have a future, it's like the future's here with you now and it's closer to you and therefore you plan for it or something. But if it's separate, you think of it as a separate thing and it's, I don't know, I can sort of make my brain go either way. So I actually have to be reminded. So the fact that other people find this intuitive is, Cole and Sean, do you find it intuitive which direction it goes in?
I have to
I
remind
think
myself.
I've been steeped in,
Yeah.
I've been steeped in it so long, I no longer remember what my intuitions were, as well as this
Yeah,
notion about temporal discounting, which is to say the farther away things are in time, the lower you kind of value them. And with that framework, it's, I think, maybe more intuitive. But, for instance, like you could imagine that being forced to mark the future grammatically, say it will, it could rain, it may rain, might increase its salience, right? And then cause you to value it more. So I think it's like prima facie totally plausible to imagine it went the other way as well. But I can't honestly remember what my original intuitions were.
To be fair to Chen, the original paper has a sort of mathematical model and is very precise about the sort of hypothesized relation. I think it does make sense in terms of like that history of work on future discounting.
Okay.
One thing that maybe is upsetting to linguists in this sphere is that people who share the same language also usually share the same culture and share a lot of other things in common than just the language. So, for example, you might just like have a culture where like generally people don't have as much money and you try and meet the needs you have that week rather than the needs you have in a year from now because you don't know what's going to happen a year from now. So in that way, you might not care about the future. And also your language might or might not have a future tense marker. So linguists are very focused on language, like the thing you find in a dictionary and a grammar. And the idea of sort of disentangling them seems like a bit unintuitive.
Sean, you worked with Keith Chen on round 2 of the paper, and we've kind of discussed this, but I've never heard the story from your angle. What was it like? Why did you go to Chen and say, hey, let's do a thing? What was that process like?
Well, so actually, I wrote a blog post. So his paper was came out on a repository, so people could read it. It wasn't fully published yet. And it sort of fitted in with all of this sort of exciting work on looking at cross-cultural relationships. And I wrote a blog post criticizing the statistics and saying, well, you need to take into account that languages are related to each other. And then Keith Chen, to his immense credit, responded to that post, saying, well, actually, I think the details are a bit more complicated. Do you want to work together to investigate this? I'll share my data. We'll work together. And we're working on this with James Winters as well, who we're on these kind of stats. And so that's really all credit to him to being open to working with people. And I think because we had a criticism that was constructive in the sense that we had a sort of solution, that he sort of was interested in working with us. And then, he's a really interesting person, incredibly intelligent and interested, and very he wasn't precious about his own theory. He really wanted to sort of find the answer out. So we worked on this, and we tried all kinds of different methods. We actually found a bug in one of the R packages for mixed effects modeling, because the analysis was so complicated that it sort of broke a load of things. And in the end, we summarized, well, in some methods it's sort of significant, and in some it's not. So we need two things. First of all, better methodology for looking at cross-cultural stuff. And second, experiments would really help, where you can actually sort of control things and get around the kind of problems with deciding whether it's to do with language or culture or whatever. So that we thought, great, we've solved it. We've put this paper out. No one will sort of run with this hypothesis in the same way without being. Yeah. I thought. And then over the next 10 years, there'll be so many papers Keith Chen, we use this original, and then not testing for sort of the shared ancestry of languages and things. So our message didn't really get out there. We sort of promised this thing.
Well, also because I know you guys, so I knew it, but I thought you meant, we have said the final word on it. No one's ever going to write about this again. But you meant people will now... This will set the record straight. By the way, thank you, Sean, for saying that, because I have maybe been passing on a falsehood, which is I thought that you approached Keith.
So did I.
But it was the other way around, and Daniel probably has that falsehood from me.
I did.
It's very good.
No,
yeah, it's my fault.
Just before this recording, I went on, and you can still find the blog posts, and you can still read Keith Chen's response.
Nice.
Yeah. So, and blogs were a thing back then. It's like how you people. I guess maybe they still are, but that was certainly like a really big break for my career. The ability to sort of put stuff up really rapidly and get responses on.
I think Sean touched on a really interesting point, which I think probably for this audience is worth dwelling on, which is the proliferation of papers on this question within economics. Because I don't know to what extent linguists are aware of this, right? So there have probably been, over the last 10 years, 12 years, 25, 30 papers that look to predict economic outcomes from Chen's original variable, which again indexed whether a language required speakers to mark future time reference when they made a prediction. And there have been some really interesting, I think, approaches to unpacking some of those issues that you were talking about to do with like the cultural confounds that linguists tend to raise when they're talking about the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And also, I guess, where linguistic relativity gets a little bit criticized is people say, okay, so there are some effects, like Russians might be slightly faster at categorizing light versus dark blue than English speakers, but the blue still looks blue. And what's the big deal of a difference in 125 milliseconds in terms of their categorization? Is that perception, or is it just slightly some small attentional bias that gives rise to some quicker processing speed? In other words, there's a bit of it, but so what? And so Chen's results, first of all, show these amazing things. There were differences as a function of this language variable in peak blood flow and in grip strength and all these kinds of physical outcomes to show that potentially these linguistic differences really impacted people's exercise propensity to exercise, which is kind of an intertemporal decision because you trade present discomfort for future health when you choose to exercise. And
Sure.
and then lots of other ones. So like wildly likelihood of committing suicide cross country in a
Oh,
cross country sample, as well as support for euthanasia. And this is because that you can construe future suffering as an intertemporal decision as well. And if you imagine, if you're valuing that future higher, you think the suffering is going to be worse, and you're going to be more likely to support euthanasia. So this is one of the other studies,
oh,
which is
oh,
heavy, but a
yeah.
very kind of big and real potential effect of some kind of linguistic variable. And then other stuff like, some cool stuff like firms headquartered in Hong Kong when it switched from Chinese to English, compared with comparable South Asian firms like invested less after it went to English in like research and development and had smaller cash holdings. So there's some really interesting ways to try to unpick the fact that culture could kind of be confounding these outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, right? Culture. Like, I think no one is that surprised that like cultures have different behaviors and focuses and emphasis and pragmatic, like conventions. I think the thing that is a bit scary is the idea that it's just language, right?
And also that I think we were frustrated that these studies were using this same variable about the future tense, which linguists are rightly sort of a bit skeptical about, and doing things like pretending there's one language per country, and people aren't bilingual, and there wasn't a sort of careful analysis of what was going on linguistically in languages, and there wasn't much sort of careful experimental evidence. And I think that's where Cole kind of came in to try and fill that gap.
I want to give the economists more credit than we're giving them. There were studies in Switzerland where you looked at French versus Swiss German speakers and found differences. There were bilingual experiments in Estonia with Russian and Estonian that found differences as well. And there were other, I think, within country bilingual experiments as well that tried to unpick this difference between language and culture, to the extent that people who were in the same country, even though they spoke a different language, arguably shared the same culture. So they definitely were grappling with this, but with these still sort of, I guess, correlational methods that don't ultimately sort of rule out the fact that there could be these cultural differences that could be giving rise to the effects.
I have to say, I would find cultural differences quite interesting without the language.
Well, I think that brings us up to the current study, which we did cover a bit on the show, but let's cover it from your angle. You didn't just look at country by country or language by language. You looked at individuals, and you did it more experimentally. So let's take a look at what that was like.
Yeah, 100%. So our approach was like, let's try to figure out if this is true or not by not trying to look at a broad sample of 129 languages where you kind of sacrifice granular understanding of what's happening in the languages, but by just comparing two languages. And those languages were English and Dutch, where in English, you need to mark a future time statement with will or another modal verb. And in Dutch, you don't. You're free to just say, it rains tomorrow. And then I guess the other major bit is we actually measured the way individuals like use language. And so I think linguistic relativity is a mediational hypothesis, which is to say there are constraints in a language's grammar that affect an individual's use of language, that constrain it in certain ways by forcing them to use certain grammatical constructions, which might require them to pay attention to different aspects of their surrounding. And that in time can give rise to sort of entrenched offline biases in some cases. I guess where we like to think we've made a contribution is we tried to actually measure and model that kind of mediation pathway where individual language use was a part of our experiments. And you can see the way that like these broad grammatical constraints shape that, and that how that in turn like influences people's decisions and behaviors.
So the idea is that in English, The grammar of English says that if you want to make a future prediction, you have to use some sort of auxiliary verb. You can choose to use will. It will rain tomorrow. But that is a choice that means that you are very certain it's going to rain. If you have a lower certainty, you have to say something like it may, it could, it should, like based on my calculations, it should rain tomorrow. And whichever one you choose, you have to make a choice. You can't say it rains tomorrow. So that's
right.
the idea, right? And Dutch people can say it rains tomorrow. They can probably also say it probably rains tomorrow. It might rain tomorrow. They can choose to do those things, but they can also choose to go with the default, and that doesn't have any that still means the future prediction. Whereas the English people are forced to make a choice. What's
That's
that Boas quote that I love? Grammar determines the aspect of each experience that must be expressed. Not what can happen,
It's
but
not
what
so
must.
much about what may be expressed as what must be expressed or something like that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
English speakers are confronted with this choice more often than Dutch speakers.
That's exactly right. And so this is where our work kind of, I guess, branches off from the notions in Chen. So the notions in Chen are all to do with the future tense. It says English requires a speaker to use the future tense, and that there's kind of two mechanisms that either makes the future seem farther away, because if you think about a tense marker, maybe that sort of indicates that stuff's happening later. And so you'd think about that marker as encoding some notion of like temporal distance. And the other mechanism is actually to do with precision. So he has two, and he doesn't say which one he thinks is like most likely to be happening. But the notion there is that when you have a tense marker, it divides time up into past, present, and future, whereas without one, it's just present and past. And so that tripartite division would cause speakers to have more precise temporal representations of what's happening in the future. And in either case, it's going to make you value it less. So all of those mechanisms broadly are to do with tense and to do with the way we're imagining or construing time. And so our work says, hold on a second. You don't have to say will when you talk about the future. What you have to do is exactly what you just said, Hedvig. It's index your certainty using a modal verb, of which will is one. So you can say it will, it might, it may, it should, it could. It's going to rain tomorrow, and you're not free when you're making a prediction to not make that kind of index of your certainty around what's going to happen in the future. So our work says, look, people discount things that have a low probability as well. If you have a 10% chance of getting $100 in a year, you're going to discount that much more than if you have a 100% chance of getting $100 in a year. And so there's this really pretty well worked out mechanism where if your kind of language is forcing you to think about how certain you are about future events all the time, that could bias your estimation of that kind of certainty, like downwards to some extent, relative to a Dutch speaker who can just say, if they want, it rains tomorrow. Although they are, as you point out, totally free to like use one of these markers if they choose to. They just don't have to.
And another great thing about your study is, and my husband, who is British, doesn't objects a bit to when I say this, but I kind of think that English people, I know not all British people are English, but English people are sort of short Dutch people. Like they're so alike.
Sure.
Like they have so many things in common. They're not identical populations, but like Birmingham is not identical to Essex either. So, so you're in a way a bit, at least to a certain extent, a little bit controlling for that cultural variable, I think.
They're among the most closely related Western Germanic languages that you could have, for sure. And also culturally, like not so different. It's not as though you're comparing English with.
But then I think that's the really interesting thing about Cole's work, and that insight about it's about probability and not necessarily the sort of distance. So that was the real breakthrough moment for us, and it took like many experiments that sort of didn't work, and like they were a bit of effect, but we couldn't really tell what was going on. And it was Cole's insight to sort of crack that nut. But then also that actually there's a lot of variation in how people talk about the future. So we kind of think of English as sort of having quite stricter rules than Dutch. But actually, when we ask people to write down sentences to describe events in the future, there's a lot of variation. So some people use a lot of low certainty language. Some people don't. Some people use will quite a lot. So that also gives us leverage then. It's not just about predicting differences between cultures, but we can predict differences between individuals as well, potentially. And then that becomes much more like a sort of standard psycholinguistic experiment. The sort of way your attitude to the future is related to the way that you talk about the future.
And Hedvig, I remember when we talked about this work, you mentioned that the future, it seems like it's not so much a tense as it is a mood.
Yeah, well, this is because I come from the grammatical typology. So tense and aspects, so things like progressive, punctual, mood and modality and evidentiality are all in this like floating abstract semantic space where they kind of go into each other. So traditionally, mood is to do with the relationship between the action, event or state with other possible worlds. It's like one way of expressing it. So like, I hope that something's going to happen. You could call that an optative mood. And the future, we're not sure about what happens in the future. We're relatively sure about what happened in the past, though, like, not 100%, right? We're kind of sure what's happening in the present. But future is, you can say, I want this to happen. I hope this happen. It's a much more loose space. It's not like the other tenses, but tense is weird in general. You were talking earlier, Cole, about using present tense like you do in Dutch for future. There's also languages, there's also where you can use present tense to talk about past events. And languages move through this semantic space and transition between these different states quite a lot. It's quite fluid space. You quite often see markers like migrating between these different categories. So it's a wild area.
I have just realized that mood and modal are related. We call them modals, all the modal verbs in English, like can, could, shall, should, may, might, must, will, would. Those are all expressing a mood, so they're modal. Wow. Okay, there's my insight for the day.
Nice.
It's a mood.
Yeah.
I think this is really interesting because, there have been these sort of thunderous debates, I guess, within linguistics and cognitive psychology around the extent to which cross-linguistic effects affect perception. And people want to say of linguistic relativity that if it's not perception, it's maybe slightly trivial. It's like down to attentional biases or categorization differences or thinking for speaking differences and these kinds of things. And I guess where my work rejects that framing of triviality as being correlated with perception is to say that like you can't perceive the future fundamentally, and you can't perceive probability, right? You can perceive frequency, and then probability is an estimate on the basis of some experience of frequency as to the end run likelihood of that event, which is also, again, not something you can ever perceive. And this work says, hey, look, we're not talking about perception at all. We're talking about abstract construals of future events. And yet language can have an impact on these things, and that can have pretty important kind of knock-on consequences. Certainly if you take the economist's results seriously. And I think that that's maybe an interesting intervention into the kind of framework around the way in which people have debated this sort of importance of linguistic relativity research.
It's a bit of a criticism of linguists that we dismiss Whorfianism. We say, oh, that's not happening. And then when it does look like it's happening, we dismiss it as trivially obvious.
Sure. Right.
Say, there's a lot of linguists, and I spend a lot of time with a lot of linguists who are in like cultural evolutionary biology kind of spaces. And I go to conferences, and there's this idea in fields that are proximate to linguistics, like psychology, cognitive science, economics, anthropology, evolutionary biology. They have a stereotype of linguists, and sometimes I get a little bit annoyed because like I'm a linguist and I'm not like that. My friends aren't either. So like you're talking about some stodgy straw man that I don't know. But then every now and then I go to a conference and I meet them and I'm like, right.
They're out there. No,
They're
I mean,
out there.
I don't mean to paint linguists as a broad class as being necessarily suspicious of linguistic relativity. I think, the way I've been talking about it is broadly true within cognitive science as well, which I'm maybe a little bit closer to those kinds of framing of the debate.
Okay, but in your work, you did find kind of a reverse Whorfian effect where, according to Chen's hypothesis, or according to a Whorfian view, you would expect people who used more future words would discount the future more because it's this weird different thing. And you found
Distance,
the
yeah.
opposite. You found that English speakers who make greater use of the future tense discount less, not more. They were actually willing to forego the $10 now so that they could get $100 in a year. They didn't engage in temporal discounting, even though they used lots of future.
So there's some complexities to those results, but that is a piece of the puzzle. So when we talk about mediation results, there's a couple different ways of talking about the effects. So there's the indirect effect, which is there's this language difference between English and Dutch. So English people have to use the future more, and then that impacts their decisions. And then there's the total effect. And actually those things can go in like different directions. So you can have an effect via future tense, which is, as you say, positive. We found that the more people use the future tense in English, the less they discounted rather than the more they discounted.
You hesitated.
I know. I had to think about it for a second. And
I do too, every time.
I know. But the total effects in those studies were either the same way that Chen had hypothesized, or in one of the studies, they were there was a non-significant total effect. So this suggests that it's not will that's mediating it, but that there is still this kind of negative effect as a function of the linguistic difference, the difference in languages. So it says maybe it's not will, but the effects broadly are still going in the direction that Chen hypothesized.
Well, let's maybe. I think I need that broken down a little bit. Let's first off, you had an experiment where you asked people to do things and predict things and guess at things, correct?
Yeah, 100%. So what we did is we gave people some little sentences with essentially a blank, and they all referred to the future. So they had to fill in sentences like tomorrow it rains. And rain was, they had to fill it in how they would say it if they were speaking to a friend in some context, which we supplied. And then individuals can choose whether they would say tomorrow it might rain or may rain or will rain or whatever it is they would say. And we measured those linguistic differences, right? And then we had them do a temporal discounting task, which is you give a kind of a choice between a reward that's delayed and a reward that's now. So you might say, would you prefer $5 now or $5 in a month? And at some point, as those times get longer and longer and longer away, people tend to choose the $5 now because the distant reward they perceive to have a lower value.
So I did, but just to check. So it's like, would you prefer $5 now or $6 later?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the later reward is usually larger. Yeah, exactly.
And also,
yeah. So you might be willing to wait a week to get an extra $5, but you're probably not willing to wait a year to get an extra $5.
That's the temporal discounting.
Exactly. It's sort of objectively worth the same, but your mind is sort of like, oh, things might happen. They might break their promise or something.
Yeah, exactly. How much do I trust this guy? I answered a poster on university campus and I don't know these people.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you're 100% certain, you might just rather buy something now with it instead of waiting all of that time.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's less valuable when it's far away.
And there was variation, like you mentioned earlier, within the English group and within the Dutch group, right? So some people were more likely to use will, some people were more likely to use may. So it's not like a language is a monolith that, like, because you have will, you always use it. There is variation between people. And what's cool about, like, Sean, I think it was Sean or Cole, one of you, one of the Roberts' sons, mentioned earlier that like that gives you a different statistical strength because then you can actually look at the English speakers who are more likely to use will if they are also more or less likely to discount the future within the English speakers, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So these individual language choices, like I like to think of it like, what is that old Greek philosopher's quote about free will where I think it's Zenon or something, Zeno. He says you have about as much free will as a dog being pulled behind a cart or something like this. So I think language constrains the choices that you have, but then within those constraining factors of the language's grammar, there are individual differences. And those individual differences correlate with aspects of your personality. So someone might be likely to use will all the time, and that's going to correlate with how patient they are. or how much certainty they kind of construe the future with. And we're able to kind of model that, as well as these broad cross-linguistic differences, constraining factors.
So this latest paper tries to test these two things. So it tests Chen's hypothesis about the tense, and also Cole's hypothesis that actually it's about modality. And then broadly what we found over the last few papers is modality explains a lot of the results, and tense really doesn't.
Hang on, I need to break that down a little bit, because
Yeah.
so modals are in English will, may, must, might, things like that. So, but we don't have a grammatical future tense. Our listener Colin, we're getting feedback from listeners like Colin who emailed and said English does not have a grammatical future tense.
Yeah, so that touches on Chen's original typology, and so I guess he breaks it down, and I think this is pretty well grounded in work from Austin Dahl into like 4 categories. So there are languages that have no future at all. There's no future tense marker. You can only use the present. I think Finnish is an example. There are languages like Dutch where there is a future tense marker, but you're free not to use it. And there are languages like English where you have an unbound future tense marker like will, but you must use, well, I would say you'd have to use a modal verb to mark the future tense. And then there are languages with an inflectional or grammatical future tense.
Spanish.
Yeah, like Spanish or French or much of the Romance languages. Now, I would say that the salient difference from a Worfian perspective is not whether it's a bound morpheme. It's not whether it's part of a grammatical future tense. It's whether there is a grammatical structure that's obligatory. So it's actually whether it's obligatory or not, which is kind of important because that's what's going to change the attentional differences that a speaker has to make in order to speak in that language. And so Chen cuts the boundary between weak FTR, between languages like Dutch that don't require a tense marker and languages like English that do, along the lines of where it's obligatory, not along the lines of whether it's an unbound modal or whether it's like inflectional or grammatical future tense. And I think that broadly makes a lot of sense.
FTR, sorry,
future time reference.
Thank you.
FTR is short for any statement about the future. So whether it's marked or not with a tense or a modal or anything, it's all FTR.
As someone who deals with practically comparing grammars all day, I can say that it is guiding my work a lot, this notion of obligatoriness, because it's very hard to distinguish a language like Finnish and Dutch in your example, because Finnish probably can come up with some sort of modal verb to say something about the future if they were pressed. And it can be hard to know if that is just optional. What is grammar in that case? And if the Dutch thing is not obligatory and it's optional, then isn't that kind of like those things in Finnish? I'm not saying that it's impossible to draw the limit, and I'm going to get hate mail from Budget Linguists now, but it's very hard when a grammar writes like, and sometimes people can also do this, but sometimes they don't, and I don't know why. And it's like, well, I can also say I have 3 tomatoes, but I can also say I have tomatoes. And that doesn't mean I have a trial. Anyway, yes. So Chen's hypothesis has to do with the idea that the future is a faraway, dislocated place.
Some weird different thing.
Cole's hypothesis has more to do with the certainty, probability. So it will rain tomorrow and it may rain tomorrow are equal in time distance from the present. They're both tomorrow, but they differ in certainty.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, Cole's original title for the paper was not when but if, which I thought was a great. But then an editor made us change it to whether rather than if, and spoil the whole thing.
If is the beginning to introduce a conditional, and they're like, no, that's fine. And we're like, okay, fine.
It was a pity.
Okay.
But yeah, that's the right difference.
So walk me through the results then. I mentioned one. English speakers who use the future tense markers more discount less, not more. What were the other results that you found as far as the modals go?
Yeah, so there are 2 papers, one that looked at tense, and we found the opposite to Chen's prediction. And so so he would say if you use will all the time, if your language requires you to use will all the time, that's going to make you think of it as far away and less valuable. And we found that English speakers use will more, But it made them, to the extent that they did, it made them construe the future as more valuable, so the opposite way. And we thought that kind of makes sense if you look at the role will plays in the English kind of modal verb system, where will is a marker of high certainty. If you say it will rain, you're saying you're pretty certain it's going to rain. And if you say it may, you're a lot less certain. And so if you think that people kind of discount low probability events, the people who use will a lot, they're going to discount less and value those things more highly if they use will. So that was kind of one finding from this paper that came out in August. And now we have another paper coming out fast on its heels where we try to unpack that hypothesis a little bit more, and rather than saying it's not will, we try to say what we think is happening. And what we think is happening is the following. We think that English makes you kind of index this choice between will and could and may and might, and makes you sort of index the extent to which you're certain about those future events. And that causes you, we would say, to think about those events as having a lower probability of occurring. So English speakers are kind of less certain about the future because their grammar asks them to make this choice all the time about how certain they are. And that in turn causes them to devalue it. And so in the paper that's coming out shortly, we measure all of those things. We measure future tense in English and Dutch, and we measure how much people use these kind of modal constructions like could and may and might and should. And we actually measure kind of the extent to which they the temporal distance as well. We have a way of measuring that where we just get them to rate with a slider how far away they think tomorrow is, a week away, 2 months away, this kind of stuff. And we found across the board that when you look at how the future tense works and how this temporal distance stuff works, all of that is just non-significant. Like I tested it in many different ways, and we find kind of no effects via future tense, no effects via these kind of temporal measures, whereas we find these strong, significant effects via the modal verbs. So English speakers use more of these modal verbs, and that causes them to devalue the future, whereas there's just kind of, in our data at least, no support for these kind of temporal notions that were advanced in Chen's original paper.
So we come full circle from as me writing a blog post saying, "Oh, look at this stupid hypothesis," to actually, "Oh no, it maybe it's right. Oh no, it is wrong." Well, actually, the general idea is right, but the mechanism is different. But it's still fundamentally about making choices, like Cole said. So, like English forces you to make choices, not just about when something's going to happen, but if it's going to happen. And that if is much more of a predictor of how people actually make decisions about the future.
So, Cole, I'm looking at a paper of yours from a couple of years ago. Here's the title: Language About the Future on Social Media as a Novel Marker of Anxiety and Depression. It was published in Current Research in Behavioral Sciences back in 2023. How do we miss that one? Social media. We found lots of influences, like when people are presented with different things in their feed, their comments show a different mood. People's mood is generally terrible when they're on social media. Tell me about this work of yours and what you found, what influence modals had there.
So that paper, what we did was we looked at Reddit. We scraped some posts from r anxiety and r depression, which are like subreddits, communities where people who have anxiety and depression can meet up and talk about it and find social support from other people who are like suffering with those mood disorders. And so I think what we did was we took the top 100 posts or something from those communities, and then we took a kind of snowball approach. We thought there might be some, we didn't want to measure the sort of community voice. We wanted to understand how those people spoke in general. So we downloaded their top posts from all subreddits that they posted to, but they were the top posters in those anxiety and depression subreddits. But it's their language from across a sample of other subreddits as well. And we compared that with a similarly composed sample from all, which is just all of Reddit. So it's sort of maybe like a sample of sort of Reddit in general. And what we found was that those speakers from anxiety, first of all, there were no differences between the anxiety and depression ones. And, maybe posting to those different subreddits is like a bad diagnostic criteria as to whether you actually have anxiety or depression, because they're often comorbid. So no differences between those. But compared to the general sample, we found that those people with anxiety or depression were using more of these modals. So they were talking about the future in kind of less certain ways. Yeah. Even though we kind of measured the actual literal different distance. So if someone was saying tomorrow, that's kind of a distance from the present of one day. If they're saying next week, that's 1 week. And so you can kind of measure the objective difference in like reference dates. And so they were speaking about objective times that were closer to the present, but with more uncertain language, right? As compared to the R sample from all, which is using kind of more distant reference, but they're more certain about it. And you can imagine if, I guess, the way we interpreted those results was if anxiety is a kind of mechanism to stimulate present action, people who have like heightened levels of anxiety might be struggling with a kind of overactive kind of anxiety response where they're immediately concerned with things that are happening in the near future, but they're like less certain about it, which makes that distant temporal horizon even less certain to the extent that maybe it's not even worth like talking about, right? And so that's kind of the broad findings with those studies. So there's these interesting correlations between these sorts of mood disorders and the way you kind of think about the future, where anxiety kind of fundamentally has some future-oriented relationship because it is really about stimulating action about things that you need to do for the most part.
I have some anxiety actually diagnosed, and one thing that happens is you do a lot of like what if scenarios, and you can imagine very, very terrible things happening in a very short bit of time, and you need to exercise your ability to believe that not everything is possible and some things are more possible than others. I was chatting with a friend of mine who recently got accepted for a research grant, and I said congratulations, and they said, "Oh, I'm not sure about this yet. It's been announced on the website, but they still haven't emailed me directly with this and this kind of confirmation. So I still don't believe it's happening." And I was like, all right, okay. You have, because one thing that happens is you when you don't have ability to predict what's happening around you, what is probable, you sort of just give up on it and you're like, anything can happen. I can fall off this roof. I don't know. Someone told me I got this money, but like until it's in my bank account, I don't trust it.
That's temporal discounting, all right.
There it is, or certainty discounting, as the case may be. As you pile on the uncertainties, the distant future becomes irrelevant to your present circumstances, perhaps.
And that's anxiety.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm still not sure. Is the language driving anxiety, or is it simply reflecting an anxiety that's there? This might not be Whorfian at all.
This study, I would not characterize it as Whorfian. No, it was all in English for the first for the first point, but it really is about looking at kind of correlations between the way people use language and I guess the potential underlying mood disorder diagnoses that they have. We did a follow-up study, which was a little bit more experimental as well. And I think what we tried to do was measure a relationship between tendency towards anxiety and depression and temporal discounting. And we did find that it was really the anxious sample in that experiment that we ran that had this effect of discounting the future more than the depressive sample. So that suggests maybe the online results are more to do with anxiety, but no, it's not Whorfian. This is really to do with kind of correlations between language and mood disorder, and maybe looking at that as an insight into the way that these mood disorders cause people to like construe the future.
It sounds more similar to work we've seen on diagnosing dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that with disordered speech. I don't know if you've seen those where it's more like a symptom of something rather than a cause.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Sure.
And you can imagine, I think, that there might be something about our personality that's affecting both the way that we speak and our attitude to the future. But then the latest paper also tests this with bilinguals. So we test the same people in different languages. And Cole can reveal the magical, because for me this is the strongest evidence you could get, right? The same person, you change the language, and if they change their decisions about the future, that seems like the strongest kind of evidence you could look for a Wolffian effect.
Yeah, 100%. So like in terms of these cultural confounds, I guess the approach we took to try to understand if we are just really measuring cultural differences, which are somehow both reflected in language and discounting, we tried to develop evidence that it was really to do with language we got some Dutch English bilinguals. These were all Dutch people because all Dutch
Yeah.
people speak English, but not all English people speak Dutch. And so we got Dutch people, and we did the same experiment. We measured their language. We gave them these kind of fill in the blank exercises, and we did some psychological discounting tasks. And we measured the same people at different times. So it's within participant. I think there was a month-long gap or something like that. And half the sample did it in Dutch and English, the other half English and Dutch. And what we found in that study was, again, the extent to which they use future tense. And when they're speaking English, they did use more future tense. They also use more of these modal verbs. And there we took some proficiency scores. So like more people with higher English proficiency used more modal verbs and more future tenses as well. And what we found was when they were in the English condition, when we asked them to speak in English and measured these discounting tasks in English, again, they discounted more. So they had like lower values for the future events. And then this was like mediated by the modal verbs. So, and the future, again, when we controlled for that path kind of had no effect. So again, we're finding like no support for Chen's mechanism, but broadly the effect's going in the right direction in the way he hypothesized, but it's all kind of to do with these modal verbs, causing people to think about the future as having lower probability. And then because it was bilinguals, you can kind of arguably say that they're from the same culture. Now, people might object and say that switching languages activates different cultural schemas. And so maybe you're somehow like activating cultural differences by switching languages. But I would say if language is able to activate cultural values, then it might play some kind of outsized role in transmitting them as well, which is essentially the Wolffian hypothesis, right?
And again, we're talking about English and Dutch people. So I again put forward that like
they're the same.
I mean, not the same, but like
kind of the same. Modals are weird. Modality is just a weird thing.
I mean, look, I did a PhD. I spent years on this, and I really came to the conclusion that like you almost can't unpack the difference between time and modality when it comes to the future. They're just so overlapping. I mean, I titled the dissertation "The Future's a Thing of Possibility" because it just seemed like everything I studied about it was that just kept coming through in almost every way I could study it.
I think the really great thing about this kind of research is that we have this sort of one negative result for Chen, but there's other positive result that opens up all other kinds of questions. And in the paper, there's various other things like every time I seem to read the manuscript, there was like a new study in it. And there's one about our perception of probability in a non-linguistic task. And then Cole collected a load of scripts of earnings calls from businesses. Where
I was going to ask about this.
Yeah, CEOs are talking about the business and what's going to happen in the future. And so now there's this huge corpus enormous thing that has the potential to answer lots more questions about this kind of relationship between the way we speak and the way we think about language. And now that we have a sort of handle on this modality thing, that gives us a way into the languages. And of course, like Cole has done a massive amount of work pulling up together all the research that's been done on English and Dutch. But as Hedvig knows, there's so many languages, and they all work very differently. And so you really need, the ideal way to go ahead in this is not this sort of Keith Chen's binary approach to two different types of languages, but you need to understand how the language works, how people actually use the language and their behavior and the culture and how they relate to these things all together. So for me, it's a really exciting sort of future that this kind of study has.
Yeah, super cool.
What do you wish you knew? If I had a magic wand and I could wave it, what do you want to know? What's it all pointing toward? What are you trying to find out?
Well, I think one of the questions that the paper sort of touches on, which Sean mentioned in terms of these earnings calls data, but doesn't, I think, fully answer, is how general is this finding that we've identified, where at least in English and Dutch, it really does. I'm pretty high confidence in English and Dutch that it has to do with these kind of modal differences and probability discounting and the way you kind of construe of how certain you are. But of course, those are just two languages, and there are 129 languages that Chen categorized in terms of these grammatical differences. And so there's a big question, like, is this general, or is this just something specifically to do with two closely related Western Germanic languages that share a modal tense system for talking about the future, right? And so we tried to answer that with by looking at the way business executives talk about the future in earnings calls in the U.S. And so earnings calls are quarterly or annual calls where the executive leadership of a publicly traded company, will talk with analysts, usually representatives from investment banks, and present their outlook there's a future oriented outlook on the likelihood of them, hitting their earnings per shares target in the next year or the next quarter. We looked at the annual ones, as that's when a lot of the reporting comes. And so lining it up was a little bit easier. So we looked at these annual earnings calls. So these really interesting kind of sample of languages, because we kind of know they're talking about the future, and there are databases that let you look at the nationality of the different directors. And Sean had done a lot of work to map nationality to the top 3 languages that were spoken in many, many countries across the world. And we kind of cross-referenced all that. So, and the other thing that's interesting is the way you download these earnings calls transcripts. They're precisely diarized by paid human annotators, so you know precisely who's saying what, whether they're an analyst, what their name is, whether they're a representative of the company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can figure out through this transcript. It's pretty cool.
Such a cool corpora.
Yeah. And then...
Can you tell them how big it is?
I'd have to look at the numbers,
but it's like 100 million words or something. It was when we worked this out, it was
I'm sorry, it's publicly available?
Amount of data.
You wouldn't have to have that many earnings calls to get that many words. They're long.
They're long. No, I think it's not publicly available, but some amazing collaborators of mine looking at some. So I should thank Sedat Erdogan and Marco Fassan and Giorgio Giotti, who did a lot of the downloading of those earnings calls, which may come out in later work, some of the work that he did with them. So we downloaded 22,000 earnings calls, which resulted in almost 3 million utterances from 8,000 directors. So you're talking about a pretty big sample of language. Now, I have to say, the number of directors from so it's mostly English, right? Because it's in the US. So the number of directors from weak FTR speaking countries, much lower. It's 67 or 70 or something like that. Obviously, that's a very small portion of the overall sample. But you can look at their nationality. We know what languages are spoken, the proportions of the languages that are spoken in their origin countries, and we can map that to Chen's kind of FTR variable. And then look, the question is do they speak differently when they're speaking in English because they hail from these countries with different future time reference systems? And so and then when you looking at those kind of weak FTR, the weak ones, the ones that don't require a marker, I think we're broadly looking at mostly Germanic languages, and then some Sino-Tibetan ones too. So Mandarin for the most part, and Cantonese and some other related languages. And this lets us look at whether, they use more future tenses, which is what is hypothesized by Chen in 2013, or whether they use more kind of modals. And what we found across this sample was that, as predicted by our kind of construal of the hypothesis, they used more present tense constructions and fewer modal ones, but there was no difference in future tense. So this suggests that, and so this is compared to English. So the strong sample is really just English, but people who come from Germanic speaking backgrounds or Sino-Tibetan speaking backgrounds, when they're speaking English compared to English native speakers, use a lot fewer of these modals and more present tense constructions, which suggests that difference is kind of characteristic of a broader linguistic difference. But, it'd be really interesting to look at languages with more heavily grammaticized future tenses, like the Romance languages, or a broader language sample of those kind of stronger ones where it's grammaticized in different ways to English.
All right.
That's really cool. That's such a cool corpus.
Hey, Sean, I want to ask you the same kind of question. Can I get you to finish this sentence? I'll be really happy when I finally understand.
But I'm not sure I want to find some. So I'd be really happy if I'm just allowed to keep playing with this data and like developing the methods. I'm really happy that this work, the sort of method of measuring people's usage and the probability together, that seems like a strong thing. And then all the statistical work that's sort of gone into this. So there's some causal inference stuff in there, lots of sort of controlling for random effects, which is all this kind of stuff that I like to do. So I guess I'll be happy when everyone has access to these kind of methods, and linguistics can focus on debating the difference in results and theory, rather than your sort of personal perspective on which sort of camp you belong to. And I hope that sort of these sort of empirical methods, collaborating with lots of people, asking these questions that transcend sort of traditional boundaries, will push people further towards being interested in sort of what's next and what does that mean, rather than, oh, that can't possibly be true.
We've been talking to Dr. Sean Roberts of Cardiff University and Dr. Cole Robertson from the Center for Language Studies, Radboud University, and the Department of Psychology at Emory University. We're going to have links to all of the stuff we've been talking about on the show notes for this episode. Is there a way that you want people to find you and find out what you're doing?
I think I'm Cole B. Rob on Twitter, but I don't actively maintain a massive online presence. But find me on Twitter, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, X.
I'm on Blue Sky, or you can look up my stuff on Google Scholar. Yeah, I went from writing a blog post every day. Once I got a job, I stopped doing that. I had other things to do.
Well, we'll have links up. But Sean and Cole, thanks so much for coming on and talking us through your work today. It's been really fun to chat, and really good to have you talk about your work instead of just us talking about your work all the time.
Thanks so much.
Yes.
Yeah, it's lovely to talk about this stuff.
Thanks so much for having us on. I really appreciate it. And it's been great to meet you both.